today I'm really pleased to be with Kevin Ruck. Kevin is the co-founder of PR Academy. He has a long background in internal communication, having worked in internal comms at BT in the post office, which we're going to cover today. Kevin's also really interesting that he has a PhD in internal communication, often referred to as the doctor in in IC circles. So we're really pleased. And Kevin is also he has published a large number of very important papers actually on employee engagement, employee voice. He's recently published an excellent book called Leading the Listening. Is it Leading the Listening Organization? Is that right, Kevin?
Yep, that's it. Leading the Listening Organization. Yep.
Absolutely outstanding book, which we referred to in our last podcast with Howard Craze. We're going to talk about that. So we're really pleased to have Kevin on board today. So Kevin, well, let's just kick off. And the first question is really so. Let's go right back. Can you tell us about your employment history?
Well, thanks for first of all, thanks for inviting me to the podcast. It's great to be able to talk. I mean, I've been fascinated with the history of internal communication for quite a long time, actually. Yeah, so it's great to see this project being put together, and hats off to you for organising it, getting the funding, and having the idea for it. It's really great to see it. So
yeah, thank you. And you've actually, sorry, you've actually, I've seen in your writings, you have actually written on the history of internal communication as well. You published on that. So
we did a little bit. Yeah, we did have a day in the Institute of Internal Communication offices I think it's about 10, 15 years ago now. We went through their archives and did a little piece on it. So yeah, I mean, nothing as extensive as the project you're doing now, of course, but I've had a kind of interest in it anyway. Yeah. But anyway, going back to where it all started, wow, that is a big question. I'm going to reveal now my age, of course, because I started working at what was called Post Office Telecommunications in 1979.
Wow.
So it's a while back. But I worked in customer service for quite a few years, dealing with customer complaints, which gave me a really good insight into the way organizations work, because if you work in customer service, you have to know everything about what goes on. And I do think that gave me a good standing when I ended up eventually sometime later doing some stuff in internal comms. But so my first, work was customer service, but then I was asked to run a consumer liaison panel, a very new initiative. It was then moved into BT, British Telecom.
Yes, because you moved to BT later, didn't you? When they had the split of the two.
It was privatised, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But there was an initiative which was to set up what was called a consumer liaison panel, which was a way of getting customer voices into British Telecom. And as I was dealing with customer complaints, I got asked to organise it. But that involved the marketing and PR team as well. And as a result of that, I got asked to take on a role in the PR team. And that's where I started. I did sort of community engagement work, actually. And then that led into broader public relations work as well. So that's how I ended up in PR. And then after that, I took on a role which was to set up a new internal communication function in a newly formed part of BT's global operations.
Right.
So that's how I found my way, really by chance, first into PR and then into internal communication. And then when I found that internal comms job, I just thought I've found my vocation. I just thought this is it's interesting, isn't it?
But, when did you start the internal comms job? When did you go from kind of external PR to internal PR?
So the dedicated internal communication role was in 1999.
Right.
It was in a new part of BT called BT Ignite Hosting. It was the start of the .com era, and BT were building data centers like they were going out of fashion. Here we are again. But then it was the late 90s, and BT had set up a new global division, building data centers and selling space. So it was a new team. It only had I think from the start, it was about 1,000 people from all over the world, But then in about a year, it doubled in size to 2,500 employees. And we acquired web hosting companies in France, in Italy. So it was a really fascinating time. But I set up a dedicated internal communication team, and that's my first experience of internal communication.
Interesting. And was in 1999 so this was internal comms still part of public relations in
Well,
BT, or had it separated by then? Was it part of a broader communications department or marketing or?
yeah, it was both. So the team that I set up was a small team of three people, myself and two people, dedicated internal communication team, and we were separate, completely separate for the PR and marketing team. But in broad terms, of course, BT, British Telecom, which was a huge organisation then, most of the internal communication teams were located in broader public relations or corporate communication teams.
Yeah, could you, and this is actually for me a really interesting question, just in a broad sense as well. When does public relations change to corporate communications? Because I know that is the tendency. I mean, it is actually quite ironic because I don't know. Well, obviously, because your background, that public relations used to be called propaganda, and then they rebranded it because propaganda became a bit of a dirty word. But at some point, PR was kind of seen as, oh, so it was. Did that change actually happen at BT? Was there a shift from public relations to corporate communications, or did they just play between those two names?
I think the whole public relations, profession, is still a little bit, even today, a little bit conflicted about whether or not
Yes.
internal communication is part of it, And I still have quite, strong debates. And a lot of people who work in internal communication would certainly not want to say that they're public relations people, and this does hark back to the whole kind of spin,
Yes.
negative
Sassy.
connotations. Yeah.
Exactly.
But I
Exactly.
think, I run a business called the PR Academy. So I think the word PR and public relations, if you interpret it in its broadest sense, which is, communication and relationship building with stakeholders, then you have to include employees as a stakeholder group, and therefore internal communication with employees has got to be part of a broader public relations function. I mean, the word public relations, you're right, is being replaced a lot by strategic communication or corporate
Corporate
communication.
communication.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But
I know, I agree. I think it's a shame. I do. I mean, I've actually done a lot of research and written a lot on PR. And, and where you were at the post office, of course, the post office, was the first organisation in the early 1930s to have a dedicated public relations department. As Sir Stephen Tallants, who set up the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, he it is in the post office. And it is actually fascinating. What we found with our research is when you have the establishment then of nationalised industries after the Second World War, so like British gas, electricity, coal, steel, they all set up PR departments based on the post office, and then they
yeah,
start.
I mean that indeed, and the history of the Chartered Institute of Public Relations and PR Academy is the largest accredited teaching centre
Mm,
for the
mm,
Chartered Institute of
mm,
Public Relations. But the history
mm.
of the CIPR, and then you look at the history of the internal
Yes,
Institute of Internal Communication, which was called the British Association of Industrial Editors.
yes,
You see these histories, and public
yes,
information was, I think,
yes,
where PR started, the idea of public information, giving
yes,
information to
yes,
the public.
yes.
But then, you start to get, propaganda, spin, and other aspects of public relations coming in.
Yeah, I mean, although I think it is important to realise. I mean, I published a paper, I think this year or last year, on content marketing in the gas industry, which was, because gas did all this content. I mean, they made films, they made music, they published magazines for their customers. There's lots of content that they did cooking shows, and what's interesting in that is and this was, what was it, the London Gaslight and Coke Company, which was the biggest gas company in the world. It was the basis, very respectable organisation. They actually, when they spoke about this, used the word publicity, but they also called it propaganda. And I think it's important to realise that in the 20s and 30s, propaganda was not a dirty word. It's only after the Second World War that it really, you can't use this word anymore. But it is important that, it was seen as that. So the other thing I want to ask is, when you were working at the post office, because I mean this is really interesting, because the one thing we do know is that a lot of internal comms actually began at the post office. The post office in the mid 70s had an internal communications research group. It was taken really, really, really seriously, as initially as part of their industrial relations, then later on as part of, I think, human relations, personnel. What are your memories of internal comms in the post office, when you joined, and also at BT? So really, obviously, late 70s, 80s, early 90s. What was internal communications there?
Well, it's a really good question, and I distinctly remember in my first couple of years, so this would be early 80s, the only real internal communication I can recall was a printed newsletter that was published by the union. The CPSA, I think, was the union at the
Yes,
time where
that's
I
right.
was the
Yeah,
clerical, and and it would be absolutely lambasting managers. There were cartoons, I remember, of senior managers with all sorts of fairly derogatory comments being made, quite honestly, about them. Was circulated. In fact, I ended up working with the guy who drew the cartoons a little bit later. He's a fascinating guy. Ended up working in the directories team at British Telecom. But he was an absolutely brilliant cartoonist. It's kind of that's what I remember. And then then when we get to coming up to privatization, I think the managers at the time started to realize that they couldn't allow this to carry on anymore,
no,
and
no,
their response was to produce a glossy printed sort of monthly magazine.
yeah.
And yeah, that's the next thing. And then after that, I think what I recall, I was a customer service manager. I had a team of about 7 people. And I was then on the end of cascade team briefings that started to be produced. So,
Yes.
you know,
Oh, interesting.
I
When
mean,
when when was this? When were the
this
team briefings
this
introduced?
would this would be mid 80s. I would have
Interesting.
put but I ended up working as a customer relations manager, managing a team mid 80s to
Interesting.
late 80s. So something around that period. But my distinct memory, and I'm sorry to anyone who produces Cascade team briefings, but I can tell you as a customer relations manager at the time, I used to get these, they were not emailed, didn't have email, and they were printed and sent round, and I used to just put them to one side and then talk to my team about what they really wanted to know that week, what we were doing. And I suppose that stayed with me because I had a healthy skepticism ever since about Cascade team briefings.
Thank you. That's really helpful. That, do you know? Because we've done an awful lot of research on briefings. In the archives of the post office. You're the first person we've actually spoken to who actually used them. So
Yeah.
yeah, and that is really interesting. To
I mean, I remember once, much later, when this is going back to the early 2000s, I think. I pitched up at, I think it was a Travelodge hotel. Yeah, I think it was in Birmingham when I was just there for a meeting. And I pitched up to reception to check in at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And there's this person on reception saying, sorry, we can't check you in, until a little bit later because we've got a team meeting. So I said, that's all fine. I'll just go and sit. And I sat in this chair, and there were like 6 of them. And this Cascade team briefing was being read out by the line manager, obviously to the team. And this guy who was checking me in, I could see him, and his eyes were rolling like this because our values are this, and we must live up to the values, blah, 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 So it's kind of like, it's unfortunate the way that Cascade team briefings have put such a lot of emphasis on line managers to just spout, corporate
yes,
gobbledygook, and
yes.
expect them to do it in any way that's meaningful.
Yes.
So that just occurred to me on the Cascade team briefing. Sorry, you'll get me going on
No,
this.
no, no, no. This is absolutely vital, because one of the things that we've kind of this is we've realized, and obviously this is through doing research, because you just find it in the archives, and it slowly goes, and actually doing the interviews, is there was clearly a and they were realizing this. Actually, if you looked at the report of the internal communication research group at the post office, which was published in 1975, actually I'll send you a copy of that. I think you'll
Yeah,
find that
love to
really
see that.
interesting. They make a distinction between management communication and employee communication, and they kind of realize there is a difference. I suppose today we would make a distinction between corporate communication and employee or strategic and op. So they actually say this quite, and actually in other archives, I think in Midland Bank, they realize that when and this was the 70s, that when you're developing internal comms, you have to have internal comms for your managers and for your employees, but the vital group was the supervisor. They all realized this, that if you wanted to communicate with your employees, it had to go through the supervisor. You couldn't just send a message straight down from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, but this is, I'm going to have to say, this is a bit of a myth. There was quite a lot of emphasis, and it's still it's still quite pervasive today, that the line manager is the most important person in the
Mm, mm,
internal communication process. Well, in the research that I've done, it's not as simple as that.
yes,
They
yes,
are the most important person if you want to talk to employees about what's going on in their work. But
mm,
if you want to communicate with employees about what's going on in the broader organization,
yes,
the
yes,
most important person becomes the senior leader team. And
yes,
obviously, because, as I just explained with the Travelodge example, employees at a team level, they absolutely know their line manager or supervisor knows as much as them, or in fact, probably less than them, about
yes,
what's going on in the bigger
yes,
organization.
yes,
And to expect a line manager to be able to speak confidently about bigger
yes.
plans or strategies is unrealistic. So it's
Yeah.
it's contextual, that point. And I think unfortunately that's a myth that I think has been allowed to
Thank you.
continue for too long. And even today I sometimes hear some of the great work's being done by the IOIC with their IC index reports, and but more importantly in the Gallagher State of the Sector reports. Sometimes this pops up that practitioners have reported the biggest problem for effective internal communication is line managers.
Yes.
So this perception that line managers are not
Interesting.
communicating
Thank you.
very well has been allowed to continue. Well, the research that I did, I asked employees to rate line managers for their communication,
Yes.
and I asked them to rate senior leaders for communication.
Yes.
And they rated line managers at about 67,
I
68% as
remember.
good
Yeah.
communicators, and they rate senior leaders about 50 to
Yeah.
52%. So this is wrong.
Yes.
Actually, the real problem is not line manager communication, it's
Yeah.
senior leader
Yeah.
communication. But so, yeah, that's just,
Thank you,
yeah.
Kevin. That's really helpful. But don't you think, though? I mean, from what I've seen, though, going to practitioner conferences, reading books such as yourself, and other books, like Katie McCauley's book, for example, from Cascades, called
Yeah.
Conversation, excellent book. So, and actually talking to people, it does appear now, though, with this shift to this more kind of conversational style of internal comms, that there is an awareness now amongst internal communicators that one of their key roles is to advise and mentor senior leadership to be able to communicate. So, would it be fair to say that idea now is becoming more apparent amongst IC practitioners?
I definitely think that's true. I mean, in the last 20 years, it's been far more, it's been far better understood that the role of an internal communication manager is to provide, really high level support and guidance to senior leaders in the way they communicate, and to change that from being, gobbledygook corporate, overly produced PowerPoint presentations to more conversational, talking the language of people that they're talking with. That's been a major shift,
Mm,
and this harks back to the old kind of like if you want to say, the legacy to a large degree, the understanding that an internal communication manager's role is to write polished, scripts or copy for senior leaders. This kind of copywriting, the old British Association of Industrial Editor role.
Yes, very
That's
polished content. Yes,
exactly, but it's hung around for such a long time, and then of course employees are very cynical about overly polished copy which doesn't resonate with their experience in what they're doing, and of course that generates cynicism and disengagement. So it has shifted, but it's been a long time to shift that, I would say.
No, definitely. And an important question here is because again, this is, I mean, I think it's fascinating. It's one of the things that I love about history is it's a combination of continuity and change, if that makes sense. So if you look at the narrative of something, I mean, we did a history about 10 years ago on Westminster University, which used to be called the Polytechnic of Central London, and that goes back from the 1882, and we did it right forward to, I don't know when it was, 1910, and it was amazing because there were some elements of its history which had just continued. Like, for example, it was set up to teach people from deprived backgrounds work, people who would not your usual middle class students. It still does that. It's incredible. You've still got that but other things have changed. So history is both, and you see that in internal comms, that some things have just stayed consistent, whereas other things have radically changed, as you say, for example, about teaching. So one question is really best practice. So we've seen this. So a good example of this was in the 1960s and 70s. Company magazines were being attacked, and then even company editors started attacking them, and so the British Association of Industrial Editors actually, and other groups like the Industrial Welfare Society, basically said, look, there's a lot of these magazines which are absolute rubbish. They are not best practice. We need to be having independent editorials. We need to be talking about, we shouldn't have what used to be called the 3Bs, or the Americans called it the 3Bs, which was, what was it? Babies, baseball, and bowling. So rather than having all this rubbish about, there was a party and, here's some sport. So you certainly have that in the 60s and 70s. There's best practice kind of internal comms, but a lot of it isn't. And my impression is that's the same at the moment with this shift to conversational, that some organizations are doing it, but other organizations aren't. They're still kind of, command and control, just communicating down. Is that the case? Is that the case? That division between best practice I see and not very good I see?
Well, it's a good question. I think it's difficult to answer that, with strong research-based evidence. So, although there is some evidence that will support what I'm saying, but I mean, I'm going to answer that question through the evidence I'm going to use. It's the conversations that I have every week with the students that I teach on my course. So I will talk to 4 or 5 students every week and talk to them about what's going on for their assignment work, and so from that, you do get a distinct impression that the way that internal communication is managed and practiced does vary quite considerably between organizations. And it's not a sector, public-private difference in my experience. The biggest factor is going to be, well, there are 2 factors I think that really play into this. The first will be what sort of director is the internal communication manager reporting into? And if it's a PR director who's got a heavy external PR media background and never has done any internal communication, then you do get a strong copywriting tell approach. If it's a senior leader, or if it's an HR director, again, it's the impression, and this is generalistic, I'm over stereotyping people, but this is the feedback I'm getting, that the HR approach to internal communication is communicate about what should be done, and and so processes. A senior leader, the chief executive, that can vary enormously, largely based on the personal beliefs of that senior leader about what communication should be like. And I say that because there is some evidence for what I'm going to say in terms of the education of senior leaders, MBAs, business degrees,
Yes.
executive leadership
Yes.
programs. We actually did a bit of research on this for the
The book.
Leading the
Yeah.
Leadership book,
Yeah.
and there's a little
Yeah.
section in
I
there.
know. I remember.
So it does indicate that the top, education programs for business leaders pay very little attention to what we would know today to be effective communication.
And would you say that I think that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, it really is. I do remember reading that in the book where you actually, and you did do this, I think, properly. It was a reliable research. You looked at a representative sample of MBAs. You looked at their content, and you found that virtually none of them
Yeah.
were actually teaching communication or listening skills. Is it right to say that?
Correct. Yeah, the listening was hardly ever
Listening.
mentioned at
Yes.
all. And where communication was included in the syllabi, it was a very much what you might call a persuasional approach to communication,
Yeah.
polished PowerPoint presentations, how that sort of approach, so yes, very, very outdated. The business education is miles behind
Yes.
what is known, been established in research and
Yes.
practice for
Yes.
effective internal
Yes.
communication is
Yes.
miles behind.
Yeah. So would you say then? I mean, I'm pleased. I mean, I know not with absolute, but whether it is or your impression, would you say then there's a negative correlation, a negative or not a positive, but between uh, higher education for managers and listening? So basically, if you've got a CEO or a senior manager who has lots of formal education, he's got his MBA, he's studied rather than someone who's worked their way up the system, does that then mitigate against effective listening and against effective communication?
It's a good question. I hadn't really thought about that, but I can only talk about, a managing director that I worked closely with in BT. This is more recently, back in about 2007, 2008. No, he was man and boy. He did a university degree in computer science, came into BT, but he never did any other formal qualifications, no
Yes,
MBAs,
yes,
no
yeah,
nothing.
yeah.
But he'd worked his way through the IT division to become a managing director. Um, and so he hadn't done any of these executive leadership programs, none of that. He was an instinctive leader. That's how I describe
Yes,
him.
yes,
Uh,
yes, yes.
he was at first reluctant when I started to say to him, you should do more listening. You don't need to have polished PowerPoint presentations. Just tell it as it is. He was reluctant because he thought, oh, I'm the managing director. People want to hear from me and in this certain kind of way. But when I weaned him off it, first he was open to it. That's the
Yeah,
key thing.
yeah.
Secondly, when he started to do some of this stuff, he really enjoyed it. And thirdly, he found it really valuable because he was starting to hear stuff that other people in his board weren't telling him. So it is, I think, down to, I can't say there's a correlation either way, really. But I
No,
do
no.
think that, that it's a big failing. I'm afraid to say this, I'm sorry if I'm upsetting anyone who teaches business programs, but I think it's a major failing that business education has not kept up with, solid academic research in effective internal
No,
communication for these.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think two things in particular I think which have really damaged um business education. And at the end of the day, business education on a very important level is we are teaching the managers of the future. I mean, that's why these schools were set up. I think the first thing is shocking is that public relations, which used to be in a business school, is now no longer. It's actually in a media school. And so there's been a complete, and of course, the way media schools teach PR is not related to business. They see it as a social phenomenon rather than as a bit. So I think that has really badly affected. So business schools, I mean, it's remarkable. We're incredibly good at teaching marketing, incredibly good. So we're really good at teaching people how to create relations with customers and sell things, but we're awful at actually telling them how to communicate with stakeholders. That's just not
Exactly.
part of our and
Mm.
that obviously has a very big negative knock-on effect to when these people do go into areas of communication.
It does. It absolutely does. Yeah. I mean, we could probably talk for a lot longer about
Yes.
the way that business education, PR education has evolved, certainly in the last 20. I mean, I've been teaching public relations professional courses
Yes.
For nearly 23, 24
Yeah.
years now. But I have maintained close contacts with the public relations degree programs and public
Yeah.
relations master's programs that are taught in the UK, and I've seen
Yes.
that landscape change out of all recognition. I mean,
Yes.
there's only one dedicated single honours public relations undergraduate program in the UK now, the London College of Communication. I mean, there used to be many right
It's
across the
very
UK,
sad.
and
Very
PR
sad.
is now taught at undergraduate degree level as a small module within a marketing, advertising,
Yeah.
and sometimes marketing, advertising, and
Oh.
journalism, or as
Oh.
you say, a broader,
Oh.
more sort of, communication generalist kind of approach. And
Yes.
inevitably, you don't get the depth of understanding from public relations when it's subsumed into a broader program. I mean, I would argue, marketing should be subsumed into PR degrees, but
Yes.
yeah, I
Yes.
think that I'm pretty much a lone voice on that, I'm afraid.
No, you've got support here. I mean, actually, what I always propose, I mean, and still do actually. So I actually call them the three sisters, and they are marketing, PR, and HR, and they all work together. And I think what's really awful in business schools is, there's that lovely line, isn't there, in the Bible? With oh, what's his name? Oh, my brain is completely gone. Solomon, the wise king. Remember, and there was the baby, and they argue, and he says, right, we'll just chop it in two, and they say, no, don't do that. And then he says, not man put asunder what God has put together. Let no man put asunder. Let no man pull apart what God has. And I think, actually, if you think about that, HR, PR, and marketing are linked, but they've been ripped apart. They've been pulled asunder, so they're taught
Yeah,
separately, whereas they should be taught together. I mean,
absolutely.
I don't know what your ideas are on that.
Well, I agree with that, and then, but if we focus even more clearly on internal communication being taught at
Hmm. Hmm.
undergraduate degree level,
It's
and
not at all.
then of course you do have the Institute of Internal Communication
Yes.
and Solent University master's program.
Excellent degree. An
Yeah,
excellent degree.
so it's a shame. I mean, when I was doing my PhD at University of Central Lancashire, my supervisor Mary Welsh tried to set up a master's program in internal communication, but unfortunately, it's a hard sell.
Yes.
But it's a real shame, and this is
No.
kind of why inevitably where my career has gone is into teaching internal
Yes.
communication at professional study level, which is
Yes.
where I've tended to focus my time. But it's a great shame to me that internal communication isn't even a module in a
No.
marketing,
No.
PR, and
No. It's
journalism
not.
degree. So
It really is. It's very, very sad. Can we just quickly go back? Sorry, because we've kind of come forward. I want to pull you back to the 70s,
yeah,
60s,
sure.
and then we'll jump forward. Just two quick questions there, and it is interesting, and of course this is based on your memory, what you call. What would you say in the 80s and 90s? Were the main channels of internal communication? How was the post office and BP communicating with its employees? What channels did it use?
Well, yeah, I mean, the 80s, like mid 80s to late 80s, I think I would say it was pretty much a newspaper. So BT had a monthly printed newspaper, which was sent. Not only was it sent to every BT employee, it was also sent to retired employees.
Yes, yes, yes,
So it had a circulation of ridiculous number. I
yes.
think there was about 150,000
Huge,
employees,
huge. It
and
would
it
have
went
been one of
up.
the biggest newspapers in Britain at
Yeah,
the time. Yes.
exactly. But it was it was like a well produced. Yeah, I know the editor very well. Ken Runnicles, who edited that for a long time, did a great job. It was a really readable piece. And had a mixture of corporate stuff with personal stuff and sports news. And I seem to remember at one time it also, for wherever there were 10 no, there were like, I don't know, 30 districts. And if you were I was in the North Downs district, the final two pages would be localized to your
Yes,
district.
yes,
So
yes.
it was great. But and then I remember the first time, I remember this quite clearly because BT was one of the first companies to have an intranet.
Yes.
So this, I'm going to say this was early 1990s. I'm not exactly sure, but I think it could have been early 1990s.
Yes.
And I remember once going to an operational meeting of kind of engineers and explaining to them that we'd be starting to put information and communication via an intranet. People were just looking around thinking, this guy's mad. What was he talking about? But so the intranet then became
Yeah.
a very
Yeah.
strong channel. This is mid 90s, and
Yeah.
then of
Mid
course
90s.
with privatization, I do distinctly
Briefing
remember
groups.
some quite well, yeah, we call them town halls now, but I mean these
Oh,
were,
town halls.
yeah, no, the
Interesting.
town
Yeah.
hall thing where we get people, it's a whole razzmatazz approach to getting everyone into a big venue. I remember once there was a huge theatre in Canterbury where I was working, and they hired the whole theatre. There must be 1,000 people, and
Wow.
but these senior leaders were all on stage doing sort of
Oh,
quite jazzy
interesting.
presentations. Yeah.
Interesting. When is this? Sorry, this is the mid 90s. Is this?
Well, the one I'm talking about in Canterbury, that would have been associated with privatisation.
So
So
mid
that was
80s.
earlier. Yes, that was earlier. But that was not so common then. They became much more common in the mid 1990s when they started to
Thank
become,
you. That
yeah,
that's really that's really helpful for us because I did have this idea of. I mean, I saw this when we did some research at HSBC that you start seeing road shows and town hall
yes,
meetings,
that's it.
but that's like in the mid late 90s. Is it
Okay,
right to
yeah.
say around that
Yes,
period?
yes, I think so, yeah.
Around that period. And one of the question is, the older form of communication, which really internal comms is brought in to kind of disrupt a bit, was um, work councils, staff management, where you'd have the management and union representatives, and they would meet, and these staff representative councils or work councils. Was that still going on and my impression is that was how you communicated with your employees via their trade union representatives. And when IC comes in, it's almost brought in to try and get around that system. There's
Yeah,
another way we can keep it. Was that still going on? Because obviously, I imagine BT would have been in the post office were highly unionized
yes,
organisations. So
it
so
was.
was that still the dominant form? And when did it stop being so important?
I think I would say that was the dominant form up to privatization. But then it didn't happen overnight. So it gradually changed from privatization onwards. And the whole culture of British Telecom changed after privatization. And it's, it, it took, I often, things people often say to me, oh, culture eats strategy for breakfast, one of these kind of well used phrases. And I think back to that time and I think, well, strategy, at culture for brunch because, a change of strategy, which was effectively privatization, and then
Yes,
the strategy that entailed absolutely transformed the culture of British Telecom or BT as
yes,
it became. And so it was in that period where, I mean, unions still existed. And I'm a great, supporter of unions, and I think they play a very important role in all organisations. It's just that the communication became owned and managed much more by management, and the role of unions became much more restricted to terms and conditions and negotiations around pay and so on. Whereas before they were taking on a bigger role around just giving information to
yes.
employees. Well, that stopped.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really
Mm,
helpful, and that's really because that again is one of the big themes of from the '60s to the '80s. And that's really when you see internal comms, I think, emerge. It's the breakdown in these representative councils and their replacement by a form
yeah,
of IC. And can we just talk going back to because I think again this is fundamental this privatization of BT, and as you quite emphasized this shifting culture from a public civil service led enterprise to a kind of customer focused dynamic. during that privatization focus, what role did internal communication play? Did it become more important? As you said, it did become more important, but did it play an important role during the privatization itself?
Yeah, it certainly did. I mean, I think, like I say, there was a real change of um, managers selling the benefits of privatization to employees. So, I don't know the reasons why managers at BT felt there was some sort of need to sell the benefits to employees, but that's certainly the approach that was taken. So when I say sell, they started to see these glossy publications, and there was certainly a much stronger um, consistent messaging that started to become very noticeable. It's all very one way, of course.
Yes.
Employees had no opportunity to really ask any questions, but I remember detailed briefing packs, being given to employees about the benefits and the way that they could buy shares and share ownership and so on and so forth.
And was there also because we often hear this word used a lot, I think, now in internal comms, this concept of transformation. At the moment the big word is digital transformation, but obviously before that you've got concepts like organizational transformation, which is really what we're talking about here, this shift from a public to a right, but also employee transformation. One of the roles of internal comms is to drive cultures which should transform employees, which will be mutually beneficial for the organization, employees. Did you see that going on in the 80s? There was in the internal comms. Was there an attempt to using the internal comms to make employees? Because obviously, if you think about if you create a private organization, you've got to change the mindset of your employees, or you're still a public organization.
Yeah, I think there was, and it was, those glossy, monthly magazines and that Cascade team briefing that I strongly remember as the attempt to, as I say, be persuasive. So managers starting to be persuasive about what they wanted employees to think about what was going on, and they did that through in BT. There was I remember in my district there was a monthly glossy magazine. In the 80s, I'm talking mid 80s, late 80s, which was just about what was going on in the district. There was the monthly BT Big News paper, which we talked about, and there were the Cascade team briefings. So
Interesting.
that's
Yeah.
really what it
Thank
was all
you.
about.
Thank you.
But it was very, look back at it now, that was, talk about propaganda. Well, I would say that was persuasive communication. It was all very much presenting what was going on in a very positive frame.
Yes.
This
Yeah.
is all wonderful, aren't we doing fantastic? And but you need to play your role in it, and this is what you've got to do. That's kind of
Yeah.
instructional stuff, and that was where it went. And then I think in the 90s, people started to realise it's not enough just to say this is give people the information. You've got to motivate. And this is where the razzmatazz starts to come in. You've got to, it's not just giving the information and sending it to them to read or pass on. You've got to win their hearts and minds, and you do that through these super duper, highly polished performance, almost theatrical kind of town hall roadshows, which is what they were called in the 90s. That's how it changed in the 90s. But then you get into the 2000s and you start to see it. This is ridiculous. Employees are not just going to respond and suddenly become motivated because some senior leaders, prancing around like a jumped up, game show TV host. That ain't going to work. And so you start to get into a whole better understanding of engaging employees, and that's where you start to see listening or employee voice, and the understanding that you need to hear from employees and show that you're hearing from them, involving them, and then they become much more engaged that way rather than just expecting them to be engaged because you jump up and down on stage.
Thank you, sir. That's outstanding. You've written several more chapters for us at those. Excellent. Thank you very much. And really, this now brings us on to uh, the next part of this is you doing a PhD, because so you went to University of Central Lancashire. Mary Welsh, and for those listeners who don't know, Mary Welsh is just a major academic in internal, a leader in the field. Well, I imagine one of the most important academics, particularly in Britain, but globally as well. I mean, her work on internal comms as a strategic element within the organisations, engagement voice has just been really, really impactful and very pioneering. So, why did you do the PhD? What was? Why did you suddenly think I want to do a PhD? I want to leave all of this corporate world behind. And
Well,
what was the?
it's a big question because I'm quite happy to share with you that I dropped out of university in 1978, and thought I was a kind of someone who really couldn't do academic stuff. But then, and I have to give a big plug to the Open University. I got back into it, and I did
Mm,
my degree in psychology with the Open University. Carried on,
excellent.
did my MBA with the Open University.
Oh, interesting.
I became a bit of a study junkie. So I was studying all part time for nearly 10 years, doing a degree and then a master's. And then I finished that. And I thought, what am I going to do now? I need to find something. And then just fortuitously, Mary had got a bursary from the University of Central Lancashire to take on a PhD candidate, and she sent out something via the CIPR for if anyone's interested, apply. And I applied and was very fortunate to
Interesting.
get the get the
Interesting.
bursary. So the real reason, if I'm brutally honest with you, it was to prove to myself that I could study academically after dropping out of university, like
Yeah,
X
yeah,
number
yeah.
of years ago. So
No,
it was a very
interesting.
personal mission, but also I think I could start to see that internal communication was becoming accepted much more as a profession, and it still lacked to a degree some academic underpinning. And
Yes,
then
yes, yes. Yeah.
it's very kind of you to talk about Mary in those ways, because I don't think she gets the recognition she
Mm,
really deserves. Because back then, I think her paper, when she was studying her PhD, was published in 2007. And she published then quite extensively for
yes,
the
she
next five or
did.
10 years.
She did
But
certainly.
you for me, she's that was the first academic in the UK
To
to
take it
to
seriously. Yeah.
yeah, and to publish focused internal communication research. So, and that did spark research in the US,
Yes,
which we
yes,
maybe talk about as well,
yes,
but other
yes. We
research
will.
around the globe. And now
Yeah.
internal communication as an academic research subject has mushroomed out of all recognition.
No, I know
Um,
it really is incredible, and what we see. I mean, I think it's interesting. I would say from the 1980s, 1990s, you start seeing books published on
yes.
internal communication, particularly Dupree and so forth. There are books in the 80s on employee communication, 90s, but so the publishing on internal comms has a history which goes back, 40 years, 1980s, without doubt. But that was by practitioners, and those books have been excellent. They've been
Yeah.
absolutely, and many of them are actually very academic if you
Yeah.
actually look at how they're written. But the idea that academics would write and research, right? So that's actually quite new, isn't it?
Very, yeah, very new. I mean, if you try to find a journal article dedicated to internal communication
Yes.
published in a reputable journal, you'll struggle to find many
No.
before 2010. I
Yes.
mean, there were some, but now, I mean, I looked at this quite recently, and if you look at the three best known journals for public relations where internal comms research is published,
Mm.
I did an analysis over a year of the articles published in those, and
Mm.
internal communication was the second most
It's
popular
incredible.
topic.
It's incredible.
So it's really that's been a massive change. And
It.
alongside that, I
Yeah.
would add just quickly the industry reporting that's done by the Institute of Internal Communication with the IC Index work, and the Ipsos Carrion and Box research, alongside the Gallagher State of the Sector
Yes.
research in
Yes.
the UK.
Yes.
I mean, that's been
Outstanding stuff.
both of those being over 10 years. So we now have an incredible body
Yes, I
of
agree.
robust knowledge, which we haven't had
we
before.
we didn't have that before, and it
No.
was incredible because when we started putting the proposals together for the grant, we won an awful lot of money, £630,000. It was incredible. We never thought we'd win it, and we had a great deal of support, particularly from the Institute of Internal Comms and from AB and the CIPR. You know, really, I was actually quite taken back by just how much information was available. I mean, the state of the sector reports alone are phenomenal. It's but as you say, that's quite new, isn't it? It's only
It
been
is.
going for that it just wasn't there before. I mean, what we found was, I mean, this goes back. It's interesting actually. It goes back to the 50s and 60s. Is you would find surveys done on company magazines and what employees think about, you know, staff. But that was very partial. It wasn't as comprehensive as it is. What's caused this change then? What, in your opinion?
Well,
Both as
it's
an academic and as a practitioner, you're seeing it
yeah.
from both sides. What has fueled, you know, more research being done by IC itself and more academics going and doing more research, both of which is excellent for IC. What's fueling this?
Well, I think the Gallagher State of the Sector reports, they started to see that it was useful for practitioners to know what other practitioners are doing and to get some sort of state of the profession, as they called it. That is useful both for practitioners, and of course it's a really valuable report in itself, um, as an annual report to do. Then I think the Ipsos Carrion and Box research, I think is excellent because it's employee based. It's
Yeah,
based on responses from him. So
yeah,
you've got the two perspectives. This is what employees think. This is what practitioners think,
yes,
and that is of massive interest, I think,
huge,
to
huge.
practitioners. They can learn a lot from
Yes, yes.
what are the most popular channels. This
Uh,
is really gold dust.
yes,
So that's why I think it hit a nerve, and I think also it's coincided with a growth in the number of people working in internal communication.
yes,
Although it's really hard to pin this down. My sense is that in the last 15 years, the number of people working in internal comms has grown. So you've got a bigger audience for these reports. On the academic side, it's much harder to actually understand that. Um, it's difficult, but I just give you my own
yes. Of course,
impression.
please,
It's not
please.
based
Yeah.
on any evidence, but I think have to put a lot of this down to Professor Rita Men in the US.
Yes, Rita
Now,
Mann, who is University of Florida, is that correct?
yes,
Yes,
that's correct. So, I mean, a prolific,
yes.
internal
Incredible,
communication researcher, and
incredible
her
research. Yeah,
work has then gained recognition, which
yeah,
has then inspired other researchers to
yeah.
think, this is a field worthy of study. And of course, also, journals recognizing that it's an under research topic. So
Yes.
that's partly. I mean, I'm not sure that's a complete answer, but
No, but
it's hard to pin
that
down.
no, of course, but that I would totally agree with all of that. And I think what one finds with this stuff, I mean, a good example of this, and hopefully we can talk about this in a minute, is research done on engagement. In that what you find with research is it snowballs. You get a big paper and suddenly it just gets bigger. So the first paper on engagement I think was published in 1990, and then
Yeah.
since then there's been thousands of papers published on engagement, and that of course has now gone mainstream with the government, with Chartered Institute of PR, of CIPD. So yeah, you do see all you need is a good name and some good publications. Success breeds success. So let's talk. Can you just quickly tell us, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners would want to know, what was the title of your PhD? What was the thesis title?
Oh, no, you're putting me on the spot. Ah, yeah, I can't. Yeah,
I know, no, I
I
can't
can't remember the
remember.
full time. I can't remember the full, but it's informed employee voice
Okay,
was
thank you.
was
That's
in it, but
fine.
it's a
The
long. It's
topic.
as any PhD thesis, it's got to be a lot longer than
Huge,
that.
and I know it's like, oh, don't get me wrong. If you asked me what was my full title, I would something about clerical workers.
Yeah.
So it's
No,
about
but
right.
the idea for the thesis was to explore which aspects of internal communication correlated most strongly with organizational level engagement. And the reason why it ended up being called informed employee voice was the results. What I found was it's a combination of employees feeling informed about the topics they want to feel informed about in the right way, combined with the opportunity to have a say about what's going on,
Yeah.
that's treated
Yeah.
seriously. So this idea of employee voice on its own is not enough. You have to have employees who feel informed enough
Yes.
to speak
Yes.
out. So
To have
that's
voice.
in
Yes.
a nutshell.
Yes. And just two questions, and then we'll close actually by talking about the IC Research Hub, which I just think is incredible. But just two things, because I've read your papers. I've read obviously the book on the listening organization, which I think clearly draws on your research from that. And I think the big two themes that run through your research and later on obviously listening is engagement and voice. They just kind of so can you just quickly explain to our listeners what that means? What I mean, you've already done that, but I know, I mean, it would say you could speak on this for hours, I know, but what does employee voice mean, and why is that important to IC, and what does employee engagement mean, and why is that important to IC? And these two concepts, I think, have kind of transformed a lot of our ideas of IC over the last 20 years.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, so employee voice has got a long history going back to trade unions.
Mm.
So the idea of employee voice was employees had a mechanism to express their, views or thoughts or suggestions to management. Now, initially that was done via the unions, as we've already talked about, but then it sort of it became expressions through other mechanisms, like the annual employee engagement survey will be a way for employees to express things. So it's employee voice is employees expressing thoughts, feelings, and suggestions and ideas about what's going on. The issue with the term employee voice for me is it puts the emphasis on employees to speak out, and that doesn't reflect a reality
No.
of sometimes, a lack of psychological safety. So that's why I started to talk much more about listening. And that's, if you talk about listening to employees instead of using the term employee voice, as soon as you say listening to employees, it puts the emphasis on
Yes.
managers and leaders to do the listening rather than on employees to speak out. So that's, I mean, it's got a long history. It's evolved in different ways, but now we talk about listening to employees from two perspectives. Leadership being capable, so the capabilities to listen in the right ways. So being open, first of all, to listen, being empathetic with employees when you're listening, responding in the right and appropriate way. Those are the sort of core capabilities for leaders. But on its own, that's not enough. You need to then have systems. So, listening is not a one-off survey. It's systemic, ongoing, everyday listening through multiple methods. So that's how listening has evolved. Now, the research is very, very clear. Not only my research in my PhD, but there are many studies now across the globe that have identified very strong correlations between listening in the way I've described and being engaged with the organization where you work. And the two levels of engagement now, which is an academic in Canada, Alan Sachs, who's really done a lot of work on engagement.
Lots of work, Sachs, Kahn and Sachs are the two kind of major figures here,
But and Alan Sachs would say, the organizational engagement, and employees engaged with the organization where they work. You believe in its purpose, you buy into the values, and blah blah blah. And you can also either be engaged or not with the work that you are doing. The job, your pay, your reward, your recognition. Those two levels seem to be distinct levels of engagement. And internal communication, obviously, is more likely to be connected with organizational engagement than job engagement.
Yes. You make this distinction, don't you?
Yeah.
So engagement for our listeners is the level of involvement, of discretionary involvement, which the employee puts into their work, and it can operate on a, as you say, on an emotional, on a cognitive, on a behavioural level, and the argument is simple. If you want engaged employees, correct? If your employees are more engaged, they work harder, they're more motivated, they do more discretionary work. But what your research and other research found is, which I think the prior research didn't look at, Kahn in particular, was there is a distinction between organisational engagement and work engagement.
Yeah, I mean, Kant kind of hints at it. He doesn't really call it that, but in his research, he kind of hints at this in
Yes,
various places,
yes.
interestingly. But it's Alan Sachs in Canada who's really pursued this distinction between the two. And, organizational engagement is connected to feelings of belongingness. So you feel like you belong there in an organization, connectedness, and alignment, so you feel engaged with your organization if you feel your work is contributing to the
Yeah.
organization's success. And this is, of course, beneficial not only to the organization, but to employees too, because
Yes, yes, yes.
they're less anxious, they're less stressed, and so on and so
Well-being.
forth.
Yeah.
And they also are more likely to be advocates. So
Yeah.
there's also correlations between organizational engagement and what we call advocacy. So an employee is likely to speak positively about their organization without being prompted, by the way, because that
Yeah.
makes it false. So it's this spontaneous, genuine, positive, communication about their organization. They're going to do that when they're more highly engaged with their organization. It sounds obvious, but internal communication plays a big role in that feeling of being engaged with the organization. It's not the only contributor, of course, but it does play a significant role.
It plays. It's a huge either as an
Yes,
independent or as a moderating variable.
yes.
Where are we doing better at the moment? Where's IC doing better at the moment? Is it in your opinion? Is it organizational engagement or work engagement? So where are they doing well, and where do they need to focus a bit more?
I think the work of an internal communication manager is nearly always going to be much more closely aligned to organizational engagement. The job level of engagement, this goes back to our discussions about the role of a line
Yes,
manager or a supervisor.
yes, that's
The
right.
communication that's going to impact job engagement most is the communication provided by a line manager or a supervisor. Now, the role of an internal communication manager, it cannot really influence that because that line manager's got to be talking about stuff that's really about what's going on in their team. And no internal communication manager in any organization can have enough knowledge
No.
about each team to influence that. Of course, what they can do is set the scene, set the culture for the way those conversations happen, the way that line manager briefings happen. So I think inevitably internal communications is always going to be more closely aligned with organizational engagement, just by the nature of what internal comms people do.
Thank you.
But
That's fast. Yeah. Yep.
there is one
Oh,
quick
there's a but.
caveat if I've got 1 minute, because of course
There's always a caveat.
it just occurred to me to say that we still seem to be stuck a little bit more in the internal communication in practice is still predominantly giving information out to people through channels that they prefer and giving them the right information, absolutely essential. But you're not going to get the maximum organizational engagement levels if you don't include listening to employees. And
Yes.
at the moment, that's where we're not really
Yeah.
stepping up.
That's where the work needs to be done.
Yeah.
No, and that message, it just runs through your excellent book, like a stick of rock. It's beautiful, where it's all about, and it's a great book because that message is there, but it's very practical, I think, because there's an awful lot of, well, how can we listen? How do we know we're listening? How can we audit our listening? So I think both from an academic and a practical perspective, it's fascinating. Now, just the last thing, and then we'll close with this, but really, really interesting. And I actually heard about this before yourself, actually, when I was at the Unite 25 conference in Nashville, which is a great conference, is the internal communication research hub. And is this new? I mean, I haven't heard of this before. How long has it been around for?
Thank you. Well, that is new. So this is something that Professor Rita Mena set up out of the University of Florida. So she has a global internal communication research hub. But a year ago, it's
Yes,
December
yeah,
2024. Yeah,
amazing.
she asked me to set up an affiliate group for Europe. So we're part of the global hub, but we are
Excellent.
based on Europe, and it's a bringing together of academics and senior practitioners in
Brilliant.
Europe to share knowledge and promote academic research.
That's it. And really, this is growing. This has grown out of what we just discussed earlier, correct? This
Yes.
this explosion of research of engagement now by academics in research, and obviously really practitioners also doing a lot more research. Would it be fair to say that it's kind of blossomed out of those?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I was amazed when I started looking at this back in the middle of last year, to middle of 2024, when I started looking at it. I found, I think over 60 academics in Europe who'd published an article on internal communication
Excellent.
in the last year or so. So, and they're not all in, some of them are in marketing. I found one in customer service,
Yeah, yeah,
so
no,
they're different perspectives, but the
It's there.
research that's going on in internal communication in Europe alone is quite phenomenal. And I just felt that this research that's been done is never reaching practitioners.
No,
you
it's
know,
not.
so
It's not.
that's what we're trying to do. But it works both ways too. We're also, asking academics to listen to practitioners
Of
and have them
course.
inform the research. So yeah.
Good. So no, I think it's great. And I suppose really the last question of for this is this good for the IC profession? And just for you answer that, I mean, look, we know that, marketing, which is, it's huge in organizations. It gets funding, it's recognized, it's more established, I would argue, than let's say IC is.
Yeah.
It's not more important, it's just
Yeah.
historically and institutionally more established. And you can talk about other things, of course, like human resource management. HRM would be another example. Now, what those two have in common, HRM and marketing, and this really goes in line with what we've been talking about in this excellent interview, is that they're much more academically established. That they have departments, they have research, they have publications, and that I think that academic research, that academic institutionalization has given the practice much more credibility. It's giving it, which then, so when those marketing people say to their bosses, we would like this funding, that's because they've got greater legitimacy and identity. They get that. Do you think what you're doing will help the IC profession in putting this on the map?
I hope so. I mean, it's still early days, really. We've only been, like we've said on this podcast, we've only been seeing academic research in a serious way for 10 years. Marketing's been doing this stuff for, 40, 50 years.
Oh yeah,
HRC.
easy,
Yeah.
easy. Yeah.
So we've got a lot of catching up to do. I think it will take time, but it will happen, but it's going to take a long time. We can't expect it to suddenly change overnight,
No,
but,
no.
it's a start.
That's fantastic. And on that note, I'd like to end this and say thank you so much, Kevin. That's been a really excellent conversation with you. Thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thank you so much.